Hello, YouTubers. This is a special session about Blazor components and in the Blazor series, where we talk a little bit about a standard changing shift that I want to make when it comes to building UI components in a way that is enterprise level, something that's configurable, maintainable, something that is readable for everybody that will be reading your code and trying to understand what it's doing. So just a few days ago, I had this amazing meeting with Brian Parker and Eagle Hansen. Eagle is the guy that invented the bUnit. It's a Blazor a test-driven framework, if not the only one that's out there. I don't know of any others. And he basically introduced us and really introduced everybody on this channel, and everybody that watched the video to this new pattern. It's basically an old new because, for people that work with JavaScript, React, and Angular, they're very familiar with the idea of stubbing a component. It's basically for backend engineers, it's just like mocking a component. You're basically going and saying, I want to mock in the storage broker so the real storage broker doesn't get called. Stubbing is exactly the same idea. It's just an idea of going and saying, I want to mock a dependency, which is a UI component, and control how it behaves, right? And I was mind blown by that. I saw that and I was like, oh my God, this guy is actually, changing things dramatically because it has been always something that, really, made me not feel very happy about the code that I'm writing. The idea that I have to know about the dependency of the dependency, in order for me to write an even better, even more standardized, even cooler code, that people can read and work with. So let me just bring you into perspective here so everybody here can understand what I'm talking about. Probably, maybe just 50%, maybe 30% of the people, that are watching this video might catch what I'm saying, but this will make things a lot more clearer to understand. Okay, here's the deal. We talked a little bit in the past about, you're having your data pipeline. So your data pipeline is maybe a view service, maybe this is a service, and this is your component, right? And your component communicates with three other things underneath. Like it's talking to a base component, and your base component is talking to a native or external UI component. So if this is your Blazor component, this is what we call base component. It's the equivalent of a broker on the data pipeline. And this is external or native component. Like what? Like when you go and say, this is, I want to use Sync Fusion, right? I want to use a Sync Fusion component, or I want to use label, the HTML native label. That's where this guy is, right? The same thing is in here. You have a broker living in here, and then you have a service, a foundation service, and then you have in here a view service, something that does the view model view kind of thing. Okay. So your component communicates with these services in the real world when it's actually running. It's communicating like this, 3 and 3, just going in these two different directions. What we do when we test these things, we go and mock this guy. We go and say, I want to mock this component. So I'm not actually calling the API. I'm not actually going out there and calling the actual API. And, by mocking this component, I don't have to actually execute a full operation. I don't have to know about the dependencies of this guy. The problem that I was having is that it didn't stand true for here. Like I wasn't able to mock this guy or stub this guy or none of that stuff, which is super problematic. Why? Because that means that my component, my test at least, has to know about an external or native component that's in my system. Why is that problematic? Because if I try to go and say I'm going to switch from Sync Fusion to Telerik, that means every unit test I've ever written ever is going to have to change from add Sync Fusion to add Telerik and whatever other prerequisite or requirements. It's not healthy. It's not a good thing, especially if this component itself, requires any additional details. My unit test has to know about this, which is a really, really bad style, right? But that was limited by the technology of our time, right? Like we started with Blazor from day one, and you would expect, some of these limitations will actually control, you have an idea in your mind, you don't want to let technology bend your will, so you bend technology to kind of, match your pattern and the style that you're trying to work with. What does that even mean in terms of code? Let me go back here. Just yesterday, I was basically working with this school guy. Milan, and we were basically building a UI component for teacher view. So went up in here, and you can see here, this is a unit test for a component, but somehow Syncfusion leaked into my tests. Why is that? Because I'm not able to mock or stub that dependency, which is a huge problem when you're trying to develop UI, especially if you're building an enterprise software that has like millions and millions, of components, like not millions, maybe hundreds of components. You're gonna have to change each and every one of those. It doesn't seem like pure code. It doesn't seem to be dependent exactly on your business logic. The other problem with that is that you have to set up things like JS runtime, which is also a requirement by Syncfusion. It starts becoming really, really messy and not very productive. So what can we do about that? Here's the deal. I'm gonna try to do this new thing that Eagle Hansen told me about. So if I take this one out and I try to run my test, I'm just gonna take the Syncfusion piece out and I'll try to run my test. Now I'm actually hitting Syncfusion without preparing my tests to actually talk to Syncfusion, so I'm expecting everything to fall apart. Check this out. There you go. Here's a failing test, and this failing test is saying what? Check this out. It's saying, the failing test is saying something to the effect of, I cannot provide value for localizer, which is a Syncfusion. Look at this error. The error itself is really telling you the story. It's telling you you're actually hitting your actual dependencies instead of mocking these dependencies the same way we mock our brokers, our UI brokers, and our data brokers and all that. So how can we solve this problem? So he came in and basically said, "Hey Hassan, I can probably help you with this." He basically introduced there's something that he has called component factories. This component factories comes in outside of the box as soon as you inherit the contextual test context, right? Like this component factories is not coming out of the blue. It's not something that you're gonna find anywhere. Your test has to inherit this test context. And as soon as you inherit that test context, you'll see the component factories as part of this work. Just letting you know, it's an inheritance of an inheritance, I guess. But just so you understand, I am running on a bUnit version. This is bUnit version, the latest version, which is 1.3.35 preview. So Eagle's still working around, the like intricacies and the little details of making this production ready. But we're gonna work with this for now. This is what we have for now. This is what I call working with bleeding edge. On the bleeding edge, meaning that something is not super ready yet, and you're already learning about it and trying to incorporate it into your work and all that kind of stuff. So in here, I'm just gonna go here and say add stub. So what do I want to stub? What's the external? It's like saying mock, basically, exactly the same thing. What I'm doing here is that I'm basically going and saying I want to add this stub, and this stub is I can add in there whatever external component, UI component that I'm calling, right? The external UI component that I'm working with here is the grid base. If you go back in here into the teacher components like this, you're going to find this guy, this piece here. This piece is basically saying grid base teacher view grid. That's my broker kind of thing in the UI world. It just has a different name because of the different nature of the work that we're doing, but it's pretty much the same thing. It's just a broker. So let's go back here and let's just do this. So add stub, and my stub is grid base like this. And this grid base is of type teacher view like this. So I replaced my grid base with something completely different in here. Okay, so that's my stub. So since I'm gonna replace this component, now I don't think I need to have this guy here anymore. I don't need to verify this guy exists anymore because I know how to verify it in a different way. So that means I don't need the ref in here. I don't need to know that guy exists this way. I'm gonna know that it exists and it has the right data in another way. Okay. So we stubbed that guy, all good and handy, all good and dandy. Now some things are gonna break because I completely removed this property on my UI. So I'm gonna take this guy out, and I'm gonna take both of these guys out. We're gonna verify them in a little bit, but I'm just gonna comment them for a bit. So I'm gonna show you how that's gonna work, and I'm gonna also, just kind of comment that guy out. Okay. What are we going to do now? What we're going to try to do now is that we're going to, since I added the stub in here, this little stub guy, I can now go in here and say, find me this stubbed component outside of the component that I've already rendered. So I can go up in here and say, okay, I want to go here and say, this is my grid base, my stub of grid base of teacher view, like this, right? So this is teacher view grid stub. I'm gonna go find this guy real quick, and then let's just add in the dependency here, the reference, and then I'm gonna go here and say this component that I rendered, which is this dot rendered teachers component dot find components. And I'm going to go and try to find in that stub, which is this type here, because I already replaced my grid base with these pieces here. All the way over here, and I'm just going to do find component like this. So what is this guy returning? I think it returns a rendered component of stub of a grid base. So I rendered component of a stub of a grid base, something like this. Okay. So now I have this rendered component in my hand. I can go now and say, I want to verify. This is like me going and saying, verify that this mock of teacher view service mock has been called. It's exactly the same thing. I need to go up in here and say, well, teacher view grid stub dot instance. This instance is your actual instance. And then I can go here and say parameters. And out of these parameters, I want to verify. See what I'm going to do here? Name of grid base dot data source, this guy here, right? So I'm trying to get the actual parameter. I guess I need to pass in the parameter so it can give you the right value. So there's this guy here, like this, right? So this is my parameters, and out of this guy, this is the data source. I want to go and say dot should be equivalent to expected teacher views. So this way, I don't have to verify that this is not null, because if this guy is null, this guy's just going to be empty and it's not going to work, right? So I can take these two lines and replace them with these two lines. The only difference here is that I'm not dependent on Sync Fusion anymore. Nothing in this code here will tell you anything about Sync Fusion. Nothing in this code will ever tell you about any external UI library. But don't take my word for it. Let's just verify that that's true, right? So I'm going to go here and run my code real quick. Here we go. And pass, right? Some people might say, well, Hassan, I'm not sure that this is actually working. I'm like, you know what? Don't take my word for it. Let's go and change something in the UI. And let's just take the teacher views out. I'm going to replace these teacher views. I'm not going to put anything in the teacher views. So teacher views will be just an empty list. Let's run this test and see. I think this guy's even going to freak out because I'm not giving it anything. How about this? How about I go in the UI itself in here? So this guy is a requirement. It's not going to be happy until I pass it something. I wonder if I passed it the type like this and I say teacher view. Let's see if it would be happy with that. I think it needs an OSSS.portal.web, portal.web.models dot teach dot views dot teacher views. I think that would do the trick. Let's see. And then of course Visual Studio freaks out when we do that. I don't know why yet, but here teacher views, and then this is a teacher view. Let's see if that works. Let me go to, I just want to verify here and show you. Yeah, teacher views all the way here. Okay, I think I put the right thing there. I think that's it. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I got the namespace here. Now I'm going to try to run my code again and see my code fail because I didn't pass the right parameters to that stub, the mock that I passed in. Will this guy fail? Yes, it will fail. See? Right? Why is that? It's basically saying in here, literally, the given data source was not present in this dictionary. You didn't pass anything. I couldn't see you passing this parameter. Ideally, I would love it to say like it's not null, just a word for you, Eagle, just to think about. You know, like the properties are still there, right? But it didn't have the right values. Let's flip the test a little bit upside down. Let's go back into our UI in here, and let's continue to have the right parameters being passed, but let's compare it to a completely different set of input parameters. So if I go back to my test here, let's just make sure the test still passes. You never know, right? Let's run this again. This guy's still passing. But instead of comparing it to the expected teacher views in here, I'm going to take this out and I'm going to say create random teacher views. So it's going to be a completely different set of or a list of teacher views that is not equivalent to the expected. Let's see if our test is passing now. Check this out. Here we go. Fail. Why is it failing? It says the list that you passed in doesn't match the test that this stub has. Let's try this in another way. When we're just driving this, let's say I'm going to hide this guy completely. Right? Would my test fail if I hide this guy completely? Let's find out. If I run like this, watch what happens. So this guy has failed, still failed, but this time it says a component of type stub was not found in the render tree. So this component that you passed in, it was not found. So that it's basically telling you that your UI didn't render this component that you're looking for. Okay, so that's pretty much it. This is just exploratory video because it's coming out of a preview where this is still to be adopted by the engineering standard that I'm putting together for UI components. It's a much better way because now my tests do not know about sync fusion whatsoever. The things that you're seeing before your eyes are the things that you're actually working with. You don't have to know about some underlying technology. And that means I have the flexibility and ability to switch at any point in time. If I go back here to the design view, I can go here and flip this guy with anything out there in the world, and nothing is gonna change in terms of the test that I'm working with, right? Because it's completely separated, and this base component is truly being mocked or stubbed, that is completely abstracted away from the component itself, and we already replaced it. This is of course a huge feature. I'm gonna just create a PR on the side, that would basically make things a little bit easier to kind of look at the code that I made and you can run it. So I'm just real quick in here, I'm just gonna put a PR here and say a POC. So this is a new branch. I'm gonna go here and say users Hassan Habib slash POC dash stub Blazor. Okay, so I'm gonna keep that branch out there just for anybody who wants to see this code and run it, themselves. I'm assuming if I go back here, let me just put it for you in a good working state, so you don't have to. Let's go here and say grid base, and then data source, and then teacher views, I think. Okay, let me just make sure that all these tests are passing first, and then we will move on to the next idea. We'll give Eagle some suggestions to kind of make this even cooler. So here it is. Let's see what's missing here. Grid views. There you go. Yeah, we totally crashed Visual Studio here. Let's give it a second. All right, and then this is the render component, and this guy is failing because I replaced the expected teacher views. So this should be expected teacher views in here with this. So now I can run everything. I want to give you a branch where all the tests are passing. Here we go. All right, everything is passing. So this is the stubbing piece. Okay, I'm stubbing this component. Let me commit this real quick. I'm gonna go and say POC, stubbing UI base components, like this. Okay, so this is this piece. Now, what's the second piece around this? What's my wish list? What do I really wish I can do with this, stubbing capability? I still want to be able to keep my property on the component. I want to be able to go and say, I still want to have a property in here because sometimes I want to send signals directly, from the back end to that component, right? It's not ideal, but sometimes I want to call these components. There's no way for my code here to be able to catch that. I want to go and get the grid base in here and say, show loading, for instance, right? Like, for instance, Syncfusion will give you the capability to have that little nice spinner, right? This is the thing that I was talking to Milan about the other day. I want to have this really nice, cool spinner that happens in here. There is no way for me to execute that through code now because, I don't have access to this guy. Someone might say, well, why don't you? Why don't you just go up in here and say, well, just create a property and say grid base and then teacher view. If I do that, the code fails because it's trying to stub some instance out there and it doesn't know. This is still because it's really raw and bleeding edge and preview. So I can go here and say grid like this. If I do that, the stubbing will fail. The stubbing will say, I expected to replace a grid base stub, but I couldn't actually do that. So this is another problem. Like if I go and do this old school, I still want to keep my ref ability to control my component from back-end logic code, but now this approach wouldn't work with that. So if I go here and run this guy here real quick, here we go. So you get an error in here, and the error basically here is basically saying I am unable to cast an object of type stub grid base because I already decided that it's going to be grid base. Something in there is a little bit wonky, and maybe Eagle has some answers to this, but I still need to have this capability. I still need to be able to access it through code. That's really, really important, because if I can access it through code, I don't have to do this part in here. I don't have to do this piece. I could just continue to have my code as is. Like ideally, I want to go here and say rendered component.instance.gridBase like this, right? So I don't have to look for it and then examine everything inside of it. So instead of this really kind of, go find the component and maybe it has parameters and look at the name of whatever, instead of doing that, I can just go here and say, this is data source, verify. Just like how I'm basically checking out my mocks. It's exactly the same way. I want to go and say grid the data source. Look how cleaner the code would look like, and this is really important for me, that the code would be cleaner. I don't need this piece either. The only thing I would be adding into my code is just this stubbing piece. And we could probably even add this at the constructor level. Like I would take this guy all the way up here and go to my constructor level here and basically go and say, hey, you're mocking the teacher view, also stub the grid base. So we're stubbing or mocking the data side, and we're also stubbing the UI side or mocking the UI side. All in this constructor. My tests, nothing changes on my tests. I have a lot less code, and the one extra line of code that I add is this one tiny piece. This is basically where I'm trying to drive this, to a conclusion just by this simple teeny tiny change. As usual, like I always say, the open source community is full of amazing people like Eagle, really, really great people out there that you can help out, contribute to their community, contribute to their open source, or just sponsor them. So please do that. Go out there, check out his repository. He has a lot of contributions, and he's basically a one-man army. Like there's a lot of people that help him, but the man is on his own, is basically driving the entire effort, and he's much, much appreciated for that. The other really important thing that I want you to understand is that a lot of these things today are not translated. There's no translations around this. So if you speak multiple languages, go out there and explain these things to people in your own language, in your own native language. The documentation here could definitely use multilingual team that can actually go out there and make this much more accessible. So you'll see that little button at the top here called sponsor, right? You could sponsor one time or multiple times, but more importantly, as you can see here, there's a lot of big companies like Telerik and Syncfusion. A lot of these companies are sponsoring Eagle because of his amazing contribution to the industry. And with that, I hope you found this a little bit useful. It's something just to get you thinking. This is where my new engineering standard is headed, especially towards test driving UI components in Blazor. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to drop a comment in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much. I'll see you in another video. Take care.